Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about chapter 16. We're covering economic policy, and this one's pretty dense when it comes to the terms. So make sure you're following along with those, make sure you're paying attention, and we will continue following along to make sure that you have an understanding of those. Take these terms, write them out, copy them from this PowerPoint, put them into a sheet, and start going through and making sure you understand these terms because they're important. As we go on in the course. Now, today we're going to be talking about economic policy in the United States, and the important place to start is the idea of the American dream. Now, generally, the American dream was kind of this idea that was developed in kind of the Great Depression era, where you kind of had a more modern populace, and the idea of the American dream was basically the belief that in the United States, a person could engage in hard work and persistence, and that if they kind of accomplished those two things, they would reap a financially secure, happy, and healthy life with upward mobility. Now, obviously, from this image here, the American dream has always been a very specific kind of goal for a very specific type of American. The American dream has not always been available to all Americans, whether that is, based on skin color, based on ethnicity, based on class, based on family, and based on region. And we're going to talk about all those as we break down. But really, when it comes to the American dream, I want you to think about what the modern American dream means to you. What is your American dream, and how does that differ from kind of the American dream, home ownership, vehicle ownership, upward mobility in your job, a spouse and a couple of kids and a dog type of situation, and that's what we're really talking about here. And so when it comes to how uh, uh, achieving the dream is accomplished, it's really contingent on a lot more than just a person's hard work and persistence. Because we all understand that if a person has a really great work ethic and persistence, yes, maybe they'll be able to move upward in life, but that if they don't have a high school diploma, their options might be limited. So education plays a major role. For some people, having a bachelor's degree is adequate. For other industries, you have to have, if you ever want to be a regional sales manager at maybe some sort of food processing company, you might have to have a master's in business administration before you're able to move up. So education plays a major role. And as we've kind of talked about in this class before, and as we'll talk about in later lectures, in many instances, education can be unattainable for some people through a variety of circumstances. In the same way, work ethic is a major part of that, but work ethic does not apply equally. Some people have a different capacity for work ethic, whether it's through, when we talk about work ethic, a lot of the time um, it doesn't take things into account like a person's individual ability. So if say a person's in a wheelchair or a person has dyslexia or something like that, they might have a really good work ethic, but their good work ethic isn't the same as somebody else's good work ethic, and so that can kind of put up barriers in the development of the American dream in that way. And job prospects in an economy where you have 15 or 20% unemployment, which we don't have right now, thankfully. If you're in an economic situation like that, it doesn't matter if you have work ethic and persistence and all the education in the world. You look at the Great Depression, and there were people who were holding up signs saying, "I speak three languages, I have 3 degrees, I know 3 professions, and I can't get a job." And so, if the jobs aren't available, then it doesn't matter how hard of a worker you are. If they're not available, then that's another barrier. So the American dream is really contingent and largely dependent on the health of the economy. And the economy is basically what we refer to when we talk about all the systems of producing, selling, buying, and using goods and services, not only within the United States but in the global economy as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, as Americans, we want the federal government to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so a major part of that is the government ensuring, being active in ensuring the economy is able to work for the people of the United States. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit later. If the government was completely hands off of the economic system, we've kind of seen how that's played out before in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that is great for some parts of the population, but for other parts of the population, they're completely taken advantage of, and that even if they have all the hard work and persistence in the world, they're not able to make a living in that way. And so we recognize, even regardless of political ideology or anything like that, we understand we want our government's role in the economy to be active. We want the government in the economy, and we want the government to be active in the economy to ensure that that it is the pursuit of happiness is preserved. Now, the main political question that we get into is how active should the government be when it comes to the economic system? Now, what we in the United States, what we have is a mixed economy, and the mixed economy is basically a combination of kind of private free market enterprise within the economic system, but public spending also within the economic system. And the main goal of ensuring a healthy economy is to ensure, because the healthier the economy, the greater the tax base. So basically, when your people are earning more and are more wealthy, then even without changing tax rates or increasing or decreasing tax rates or things like that, the government is doing well as a result. Kind of the better the economy does, the better the government does in terms of how it can collect revenue and then appropriate that revenue for other spending systems. And so what the United States does is that it applies what's called economic policy, basically all the policies that are put into place to ensure a healthy economy. And when we talk about a healthy economy, there's a couple of different ways that we track that. We generally track a healthy economy through a mix of increasing global gross domestic product, which we'll talk about in a second, low unemployment rates, and low inflation rates. So economic growth in its rawest form is measured in gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is basically the total value of all goods and services produced within a country. If your gross domestic product is increasing, generally that's a good thing. Now, gross domestic product is like demographics, and what I mean by that is it is raw and overbroad data that can show a little bit of a trend, and can show a trend if your GDP is increasing, that's generally positive. But it's not always going to be a perfect indicator of how well a country is doing, is or isn't doing. When it comes to inflation, inflation is basically the term that we use for the decreased value of money. And when money decreases in value, prices of things go up. So the most direct result of inflation is increasing consumer goods prices. And so when you have a situation in which inflation is growing too quickly, then that can make goods more expensive. A healthy economy experiences inflation around 1 to 3%. So basically you have a decreasing value of money, which increases the cost of goods. But at the same time, you hope to see an increase in wage growth at about the same 1 to 3% rate. So you have wage growth, you have moderate low levels of inflation, and that is a sign of a healthy economy. Low unemployment is also a sign of a healthy economy. And when we talk about low unemployment, what we want is around 5%. Now, 5% is basically the indicator or the factor that at which point it is generally assumed that most of the people who, almost all the people who want to get a job can get a job. There are some scenarios where they're permanently unemployed or the unemployable, and those are the kind of the outliers of these systems. But with an unemployment of around 5%, usually people who are wanting to get a job can get a job. And so If you start to see increasing numbers, 6, 7, 8%, you start to see concerns. 9, 10% is an area of greater concern. Once you get up to 15%, then there's a lot of alarm bells going off, because then you have a big portion of the population that are looking for jobs that can't find them. Now, those three measures are kind of the main indicators of economic health, but they're certainly not the only indicators of economic health. Some of the ways that we track economic health in the United States is through the poverty rate. And the poverty rate is basically the indicator of how many families within a certain area live in poverty, at or below the poverty threshold, which is basically the line under which a person is considered to be impoverished, where they're not necessarily making enough money to meet their daily needs or meet their yearly needs. An ideal healthy economy would have a poverty rate of 0, where everybody has enough in the economic system to have enough food to eat, or have a roof over their heads, whether that's renting or buying or whatever. Now, when it comes to economic policy, like we're going to talk about a little bit later as well, ideal is never actual, and ideal is not going to be actual. And an ideal unemployment rate would be 0, obviously. An ideal poverty rate would be 0, obviously. But that's just not going to. It's not the reality that we live in. There are always going to be instances where people are at or below the poverty line for a variety of different reasons. So when it comes to poverty in the United States, and particularly in Oklahoma, and even more particularly in Ottawa County, what we see is more rural areas tend to be have a higher level of poverty, and so the U.S. poverty rate is 11.8%. So basically 11.8% of the U.S. population is at or below the poverty line. And I think the poverty line is around about $18,000 to $20,000 median household income. Basically, that the amount of money coming into a household in a given year is about $20,000. The Oklahoma poverty rate is 15.2%, which is about 4 percentage points higher than the national rate, close to 4%. But interestingly, the Ottawa County poverty rate is 18.5%. So not only is the Ottawa County rate almost 7 percentage points higher than the U.S. national average, it's also over 3 percentage points higher than the Oklahoma average. So what we see, and when we talk about Pell Grants and things like that, even if you're in a situation where you feel that your needs are met, there are almost 20% of the residents in Ottawa County are considered to be at or below the poverty level, or the poverty line. And the one way that we track the poverty line is through median household income, or household income. That's all the money that's coming into a house within a given year. Now, household income can give an insight into a community and its economic health. So, for example, the U.S. median household income is about $67,000. Now, there's a lot of caveats to that, because the median income for California is going to be a whole lot higher than the median income for Ottawa County, Oklahoma. And it's because those places are more expensive to live. You go to Los Angeles, you go to New York, you go to Miami. Those places are going to be more expensive to live, and so you're going to see a higher median household income. In Oklahoma, the median household income is about $52,000, and in Ottawa County, the median household income is about $39,000. So that's all money post-tax that that is going into a household. So what we're seeing is Oklahoma is about $15,000 less than the national average, and Ottawa County is nearly $30,000 less than the national average. So that gives us an indicator of kind of the rates of income. So if you find yourself, if you're in a family above that national average, then you're going to be more likely to be comfortable in the area where you are. If you find yourself below that, you might find your family to be less comfortable, maybe making some difficult choices on, trying to restrict eating out, or trying to make some of those moderate choices to reduce spending, or even more severe choices on spending, like, am I going to get my car fixed, or am I going to buy milk or bread this week? And those are the very real questions that people are asking. So when we talk about the economy, it's really important to recognize that, yes, there's this overarching idea of, oh, well, economic policy is based on political ideologies and theories and blah 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 blah. But when we talk about the economy, what we're talking about are the people who are in poverty, the people who are not in poverty, the people who are trying to earn an education but can't, the people who have an education but can't get a job. So when we're talking about the economy in the United States, that's what we're talking about: the cost of goods, the cost of services, the living conditions that people are in, the types of things that people can and can't afford, and the types of economic choices that people are having to make. Now, in the economic policy of the past, we have several different theoretical frameworks that we use when we talk about economic policy. So, for instance, the early 20th century politicians favored what was called laissez-faire capitalism. And laissez-faire capitalism is basically let them be. And it is basically minimal or no interference from the government. The government was there to serve the national defense, and that was essentially it. Maybe some regulation of interstate commerce, but the idea was let the free market play out. But what happened was, during that time, that's when you had the era of railroad barons. That's where you had the era of steel monopolies and things like that, where you had these big businesses were able to accumulate power and muscle smaller businesses out of the marketplace and secure monopolies over industries, and then have the ability to put prices at whatever they want, whatever the market would bear. So into kind of the early 20th century, when we have the rise of progressivism, and that's a kind of a discussion for an American history class. But when we have the rise of early 20th century progressivism, you have the idea that the people and the governments have the ability and responsibility to ensure that the citizens are able to compete in an economic marketplace. So, small businesses, even if they're small, should have the ability to compete within a marketplace. Things like that. So what we have is a system where most politicians today agree that some form of regulation is necessary to ensure economic balance, to ensure that if kind of the inventor stereotype, where if you have an idea that is good enough and you can produce a product that is good enough and cheap enough, then you could potentially outcompete any competitor, essentially, no matter how big they are. If you make the product better and cheaper, or just better and more attractive, then you would have the ability to compete in that way. And so what we saw is a shift toward Keynesian economics. Now, there are obviously differing views on economic policies, but in the kind of 20th century, we saw a shift by both Democrats and Republicans toward Keynesian economics. And Keynesian economics is basically the idea that the government can stimulate the economy by increasing spending and cutting taxes. So John Maynard Keynes, the economist who was formulating this idea, was basically like, you can stimulate economic activity in a couple of ways. One, you can increase the amount of money within the market by increasing spending. Well, one of the best ways to do that is by increasing federal spending. If you want to increase spending in the healthcare marketplace, or the mental health marketplace, then the federal government can provide grants to mental health care providers to increase the economic activity within that area. On the opposite side, the argument was you could stimulate growth stimulate the economy by cutting taxes, basically having people have more money in their pockets because they're not paying as much in taxes. And so what we've seen over the past several decades is a shift to where Democrats are more likely to advocate for government spending programs that are meant to stimulate the economy and support the populace, whereas Republicans are generally going to be on the side of favoring cutting taxes. And that has kind of been developed into a policy called supply side economics, colloquially known as Reaganomics. But this is kind of trickle down economics. The idea is taking supply side economics, cutting taxes to promote investment and to promote growth. And the idea of supply side economics is that if you cut taxes, first of all, people will have more money and they will be more likely to spend that money. But the trickle down economic system was developed where if you cut taxes on large corporations or industries, that they would then reinvest in research and development, reinvest in their workforce. Now, there's been conflicting economic research about the actual effects of trickle-down economics, but there are certainly examples kind of that each side will hold up and say, well, look, this is where trickle-down failed. Look, this is where trickle-down succeeded. But in addition to focusing on the supply side economics portion, supply side argues in favor of deregulation, basically limiting regulations on productions that would reduce production costs. The downside is if you limit regulations, then you have an increased likelihood of either poor quality products or potentially dangerous products or things like that. So there's a pretty intense political debate over the types of regulations that should be implemented and how they can be implemented. Now, more modern discussion in economic theory has been monetarism, and monetarism is basically the idea that instead of more traditional Keynesian economics, it kind of builds on that and says that the government, in order to maintain a healthy economy, should regulate the supply of money to ensure that inflation stays low. The idea is that when inflation is low, people will be able to rely more on prices, and they'll be more likely to engage in the economic system. And so monetarists will focus on avocation of monetary policy to regulate inflation, whether that is releasing more money into the economy to increase inflation or restricting the amount of money in the economy to decrease inflation. And that this monetarism was really spearheaded by Milton Friedman as pictured here. Now, when it comes to the types of fiscal policies that the United States federal government will implement in kind of economic in the economic realm, the two major areas are taxation and spending. Taxation is the basically collecting money from the population to pay for the things that the federal government does. So the American tax system is graduated or progressive. So basically taxation increases for higher income earners. On a straight income tax, basically the more money you earn, the higher your percentage, your bracket, the more likely you are to enter into a new bracketed percentage, and so the higher percentage of that money you'll pay out. The reason why I'm so kind of particular about the way that I'm wording this is if you look down here at the bottom, this is incredibly important. One of the main talking points that people will say is, oh, well, if I move from making $35,000 to $45,000, now I'm taxed at 22% instead of 12%, so I don't want to make a raise, which is not true. One of the biggest misconceptions that people have about taxation is that when you move into a new tax bracket, all of your income is taxed at the same rate, which is not the case. The way that you are taxed, if you are a single income earner and you earn $25,000, the first $9,950 is taxed at 10%, no matter how much you make. Only the amount from $9,951 up to $25,000 is taxed at 12%. So you're only paying a higher tax on the extra earnings over the top. So if you're making $45,000, your first $9,950 is taxed at 10%. Your next group from $9,951 to $40,525 is taxed at 12%. But the only thing that's taxed at 22% is the amount between $40,000 and $45,000. So you're never going to be making less money overall in based on the taxation. Those change when you go to married filing jointly. If you have a joint income, it kind of takes these numbers and doubles them. There are some benefits there that marriage does provide. So when we talk about tax policy and things like that, I think it's really important to recognize that, kind of dispel that misconception that just because you're making more money in a given in a given raise, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to be paying 10% more in your total taxes than you were paying before. So if you have a chance to get a raise, take that raise, no matter if it puts you technically into the next tax bracket or not. Now, the U.S. income tax system is progressive. Basically, the more money you make, the higher your tax goes. So if you're making up here at $500,000 or more, you're taxed at 37% on anything over $523,000. Capital gains tax, basically anything that you make within the stock market or selling property or buying and trading and things like that, that's all taxed at different rates. Corporate rates are taxed at different rates. But for basically standard income, which is what many people in the United States operate under, basically you work a job, you get paid income, then they fall into this tax system. Now, a regressive tax means that lower earners pay more of their income than higher earners. So a good example of this is sales tax. Often, and this is one of the critiques of a flat tax. A popular political argument is that, oh, well, let's simplify the tax code by having a 8% flat tax, and that everybody in the United States, regardless of income, pays 8%. Well, the issue there is that, like a sales tax, a person who has $10 to spend and they spend $5 and pay 50 cents as part of their tax, they have now spent $5.50. The 50 cents is a greater percentage of their overall available money to spend than if somebody came in with $100,000 and spent $5 and spent the 50 cents in tax. So basically, the more money you have available, the less a flat tax will impact you. So even though, yes, everybody's paying the same tax no matter what, in that situation, the person who has more money available to spend will be less affected by that tax than people who have a lower ability to spend. And so a regressive tax, like a sales tax, is often, and that's often why you'll see people kind of coming out against flat taxes or sales tax increases, because that shifts the burden of taxation in a way that can potentially disadvantage lower income earners. One of the major goals of the progressive tax system in the United States is to reduce disparities in wealth. This is basically a taxation system that encourages redistribution. So basically, the idea is that as the income gap widens, as the ability, as higher income earners have or hold a larger percentage of the wealth in the United States, the progressive tax system is focused on basically using those higher taxes on higher income earners, and then using that in economic policies or spending policies that benefit schools or benefit education or benefit roads and things like that everybody is going to use regardless of whether or not they are in that higher income bracket. Now, the issue comes in when, in many instances, loopholes allow businesses to reduce their tax liabilities by writing off expenses. Essentially, the idea is that if you lose a bunch of money in a year and you're not making any profit, then your taxable income at that point is essentially zero. So what companies will do many times is they will basically, instead of paying money in taxation, they'll run up a bunch of expenses over the course of a year and to offset their earnings. And this kind of economic and taxation gymnastics has allowed, in certain instances, companies like Amazon, who are making billions of dollars a year, to pay very, very little of their overall profit in actual taxes because of offsetting costs that they've written off as losses. And so that's when people are critical of the current tax policy in the United States. A lot of the time it's because of these types of issues. In the same way, when smaller communities are trying to recruit large businesses to come into their community, in many cases they'll give them, like grant them pretty large tax shelters where they are not necessarily required to pay local taxes or community taxes. Now, the idea behind this is the community says, well, yeah, we're not collecting a tax from this company, but the increased spending within the community, the increased economic activity within the community is still a benefit. And so there's certain instances where those companies will try to take advantage of those favorable spending packages in terms of the tax policy. Now, on the other side of this, you have spending policy. So taxation policy is one part. The second part is how are you going to spend the money that you collect? And the government distributes funds basically through two systems: discretionary and mandatory spending. Mandatory funds can't be controlled through the regular budget process. They are basically set aside at the beginning, and every year through the budget process, there's money that's set aside that's already being spent. However, the second part, discretionary spending, is where most of the discussion happens. And these are funds that can be controlled through the budgeting process. Now, the budgeting process, like I said before, the Congress has the power of the purse. They have the ability to appropriate funds. It starts with the president, who will deliver an executive budget early on in the year. And the executive budget is basically a wish list. It goes to the Office of Management and Budget through the White House Executive Office of the Presidency. And then that's kind of the wish list that the president wants the fiscal policies that they want to implement. And they deliver that to Congress, and Congress can take that and either throw it out the window or they can try to implement those things. Usually what you'll see is the party of the president will try to align with the president's wishes in terms of how they want to implement this policy. But either way, ideally, the Congress will pass a concurrent budget resolution in April. That resolution is broken down into 12 different appropriations bills for the different areas that they apply to. They'll go through reconciliation, they get voted on, and the idea is they get voted into effect and implemented in October. Now, I've used the word ideal a lot, which probably indicates to you that that's not the way that we operate in the modern era. It is more likely that the budget discussion is always going to be messy. What we've seen in the past several years is budgeting through process of continuing resolution, in which instead of focusing on passing new budgets and things like that, you have a continuing resolution, which is kind of keeping the same level, keeping the spending at a current level as a stopgap so that you can continue budget negotiations past October. Ideally, most Americans like the idea of, you don't want to spend more money than you make. But deficit spending is the norm in the United States. Basically, spending more money than is coming in, with the idea that increased activity is beneficial, more beneficial than the actual debt. And there are a lot of economists who will argue that the U.S. debt is essentially limitless. That there are economists that will argue that the debt limit in the United States doesn't really matter, and that it is, like I said, more beneficial to increase debt than it is to try and decrease services that are already being provided in terms of spending and things like that. And so what we've seen in the past several years is a lot of fights over what's called the debt ceiling. And the debt ceiling is basically an artificial limit that Congress puts in place for itself to say you can't borrow any more than X amount. And that what happens is you eventually reach the debt ceiling, then there's a big fight. There might be a brief government shutdown in which money isn't being spent, and then there's an argument and a discussion, and then the debt ceiling is inevitably raised, and then new appropriations are made. And a lot of the reasons that this occurs is because there's really not much of an incentive to rein in spending. In many cases, you have legislators who will, they don't feel like they have any guarantee of being reelected. So what they're trying to do is get as much benefit as they can for their, for the district as possible. And so there's not really a whole lot of emphasis behind balancing the budget in Congress, even though there's going to be tons of talking heads, tons of Congress people kind of saying that that's what they want to do. When push comes to shove, obviously they're not doing it, and they're not agreeing on that. So it's fiscal policy and economic policy at that level where debt, country to country debt, it's a really unique and a strange economic situation that people get PhDs studying, and even at that point they're still divided on whether the debt even matters in some cases, whether a deficit even matters in some cases, and so there's a lot of different ways to kind of view the economic system when it comes to the national budget. Now, the government does protect the public through regulation and antitrust. We've talked about this before, and we talked about earlier how in the 19th century you had kind of the formation of these monopolies where one company or a small group of companies would dominate an entire marketplace. And so the U.S. government, outside of the spending policy, will implement regulation in order to prevent monopolies. Like I said, single firms or small groups controlling all the goods or services within a particular market. And this is called antitrust policy, basically, trying to ensure that these groups don't get too large. And this type of regulation is a major political issue as well. Kind of how is that applied? How should it be applied? That sort of thing. And then finally, we're going to talk about trade policy in the global economy, because the United States prior to 1900 was not really all that active in terms of international trade by choice, but really in kind of World War I, post World War I, into this, kind of with the rise in Theodore Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson, World War I, then on into World War II, the United States has become a major player, one of the major players in the global economy. And the global economy is basically all of the buying, spending goods and services between countries. It is not difficult now to go online, buy something from England, and have it at your doorstep within a week. And so the United States is a major player in that country to country type of policy, but also the individuals within those countries can play a major role as well. The government actually receives most of its revenue, most of its tax revenue, from what are called tariffs, and these are just taxes on imported goods. We think of, the income taxes, where the money's really coming from. Well, actually, most of the money is coming into the United States government through customs and tariffs, taxes on other countries, basically on the goods that are coming in. Sometimes that's translated to an increased cost of the product. Sometimes that is translated back to the country of origin. And so when it comes to economic policy in foreign affairs, one of the things that the U.S. government is focused on most is, what do we do when U.S. businesses are in competition with foreign businesses? And one of the ways that can be addressed is through protectionist trade policy. Protectionist trade policy are policies that shelter U.S. goods from foreign competition, whether by increasing tariffs, or limiting the amount of goods that can come in from, basically restricting the supply from another country. This increases the prices on those goods, and if a that good costs more in the United States to produce, that makes them more competitive. Another way that the United States can ensure that its own domestic products are competitive is through government subsidies. So government subsidies are basically either cash payments or resources that are available to individuals or groups within a certain economic area, which is basically a financial incentive to encourage them to produce a particular good, and those subsidies will generally make that more cost effective and kind of make those products more competitive. And what we'll see in many cases is kind of on kind of the scale of global diplomacy, manipulation of tariffs, manipulation of subsidies, and things like that to make imports more or less valuable, things like that in terms of international trade. And so that can play a major role in the economic health of the United States as well. So as we go through these last couple of chapters, we're going to be talking about kind of the different types of policies that can be applied or that are applied in the case of the United States, and continue reading along as we go on, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Bye.